So tonight I'm going to step into Catherine Sievet's energetic shoes, though I also ask her how she does it all the time and what vitamin she takes. But I'm going to start our conversation on inlands tonight, and I'm happy to step in first to recognize that the land we're on tonight that we live and work on is Indigenous land, known as the people of Lenapehoking. Lenapehoking is the homeland of the Lenape, or Delaware people, encompassing parts of present-day Western Connecticut, Eastern Pennsylvania, the Hudson River Valley, New Jersey, and Delaware, with Manhattan at its center. And for at least 10,000 years, Indigenous people have lived on, cared for, and cultivated these lands, and continue to do so today. So additionally, I want to start with a special thanks to Ray, Aaron, and Melissa in the LARP office. With their support, these events would not be possible, and that includes IT and AV and many others who work hard behind the scenes, so give them a big thanks when you see them next. Yeah, thanks for the applause. So it's been my pleasure to curate the Penn Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning Lecture Series this spring. First, a note about the theme, inlands. It's scholars like Kofi Boone, Thaisa Way, slated for February, and Caroline Tracy, who will join us in April, that really inspired me to think about and with inlands. So the series came into being concurrently as I started working with students and community partners, thinking about and teaching about inland wetlands, marshes, mires, bogs, and other muddy terrains long dismissed as wastelands in North America during the 19th and 20th centuries, which instead offer vital sites of historical memory and restorative becomings. So this series, Inlands, really embraces the geographic ground of inlands, so not coastal places, but inland places, rivers, marshes, and lakes. And the conversations also take up and extend a conceptual framework of inlands to think about scholars and scholarship that don't follow the beaten path. So this series brings together three types of thinking and thinkers. So from landscape practice, landscape teaching, and landscape writing. And though each person invited over this semester could likely speak on each with equal expertise. So tonight, just to make a quick note, is also a double celebration. It's first a celebration of an edited volume, Climate Change Models in the Built World, where Kofi and his co-authors, Travis and Andrew, contributed one of the book's most thoughtful and thought-provoking pieces. And I want to mention that any co-edited volume is a feat. And my climate change co-editors, Mara Freilich, Ermak Turan, and Lizzie Urena were collaborators and stalwarts through every twist and turn. So Mara, Ermak, and Lizzie, they each deserve to be mentioned at least once tonight. So collaborating and writing alongside a climate scientist, a building scientist, and an urban planner as a historian was one of the greatest joys of my career thus far. So from a DiCaprio-funded ideas competition to a silo-bending symposium at MIT to the volume in my hands today, in all scholarship we build with others. And in this book, it is literally built with scholars, practitioners, artists, scientists, policymakers, and more to really think about models, think about climate change differently together. So in the second celebration, the reason why you're all here tonight, not to listen to me, is the celebration of Kofi Boone and his co-authors, Travis Klondike and Andrew Fox, from the book's 13th chapter, a piece which focuses on the work in Eastern North Carolina and rural communities' access to resources and data in hazard mitigation planning. And the contribution that Kofi will talk about tonight a bit came way before Hurricane Helene devastated the state. And as I read the piece back this week, it illuminated much of the devastation that did happen. Not a prediction, but a known disaster waiting to happen. So it is my genuine pleasure to welcome my colleague, and I'm going to say now friend, Kofi Boone, tonight. So Kofi is the Joseph D. Moore Distinguished Professor and University Faculty Scholar at NC State University. His work brings together landscape architecture and environmental justice with a focus on democratic design and interpreting culture. Interpreting cultural landscapes. So my students read his work every year, but his awards and published work are too numerous to really list. But I'll highlight that his recent co-edited volume, since we're celebrating books tonight, Empty Pedestals, received the 2025 Professional Honor Award in Communications from the American Society of Landscape Architects. Congrats. And was a finalist for the 2025 J.B. Jackson Book Prize from the University of Virginia Center for Cultural Landscapes. So without further ado, Kofi, I'd like us all to welcome you tonight.
Thank you. I know a lot of y'all came for free dinner, and that's all right. I'll just be the dinner entertainment while you're eating, so you can eat and listen at the same time. I'm happy to be here. Happy to see colleagues again. In my days at LAF, of course, tip of the cap to your dean. So thank you, Chris, for your leadership. I'm sorry Catherine's not here, fellow Detroiter, but know her well and wish her well. And of course, new friends and old, it's great to see you. And to students, so hopefully future colleagues that will help carry this conversation forward. I am a native of Detroit, Michigan. I am not a rural or country person. But when I moved to North Carolina, a lot of the imperatives that I did believe in were found in those places. And I did mention to Jessica earlier the culture shock I had as really an urban person who grew up in a very Black city, being in spaces where that just wasn't true, and trying to figure out a way to be of service and of value and to uplift the voices of people who are trying to make positive change in that place. So this book chapter that we'll reference, that is paraphrased in this title, A Just Recovery, is from actual practical experience grappling with the resilience and recovery infrastructure that we're faced with in the United States. And this is before the most recent change in administration. So some of this is starting to link very practical, hands-on, applied learning with higher order policy imperatives, and we'll close the lecture with that part of it. So getting to it, want to thank Jessica and all the co-editors and authors of that volume once again. Andy is more famous than I am, so you all probably know who he is, but he founded and started the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab in NC State about a decade ago, and he and Travis lead that entity. So some of the work that is shown came out of their shop as a part of it, and that's one of the reasons why I recruited them to be partners on the chapter, because they are literally in the trenches working in that space. The image that was used to advertise the lecture is not from the chapter, but deals broadly with the issue. This is an image of two places that are less than 1,000 feet away in an eastern North Carolina city called Kinston, North Carolina. On the left, you see efforts to, they both were hit with multiple hurricanes. But in real time, you can see how decisions were being made in terms of what places had value and therefore which places were protected by policy, received resources, and which were not. And in the American South, there's a very straightforward answer about why that's true, which we'll dig into a little later. But we are presented with this condition all over our state and across rural places that have been affected by hurricanes and floods around the country. In Kinston, we had the benefit of being able to build partnerships. So we have former students who lead the Office Design Workshop. There's a Design Workshop Foundation, which allows that big organization to work on pro bono and low rates in partnership with nonprofit organizations. There's also a very prominent nonprofit organization based in Kinston, Kinston Teens, led by Chris Suggs, who until a couple years ago was the youngest public official in the entire state of North Carolina. He was elected to the city council of Kinston when he was in high school. And he really focused on trauma-informed design, the idea that when you're hit with repeated displacing activities, floods, fires, hurricanes, it's not just a physical infrastructure that's damaged or harmed, it's physical, it's mental, it's emotional. And if we don't look at those other aspects of it, then we are hurting our capacity to deal with the physical trauma of it. And this project, which was envisioned as a new center that would really work to support the town to become more resilient, was a really interesting process that was community driven. And he opened our eyes to think of the wide array of issues that are affected when we deal with resilience. So we usually think of what he called dark sky days. That's on the right of that diagram. And so what do you do in the midst of a crisis, right? People need beds, they need access to medical supplies, they need ways to have telecommunications, reach out to loved ones. There's sort of a crisis, I would say, the situation. But there are chronic underlying issues with repeated exposure to these traumas and stresses that also need as much care. And so the ability to think about what we call blue sky days, when there isn't a hurricane, there isn't a fire, there isn't a flood, what are we doing to build the resilience of the people so that they're better prepared the next time they're faced with a shock? And with disasters, as was referenced by Jessica in the beginning, for people who don't know North Carolina geography, we have 4 major regions, ecoregions in our state. So the western edge is the mountains. The middle is the Piedmont, that's where NC State is located. And we have a coastal plain, and we also have sandhills. And the sandhills is unique because it's the only place where there are natural lakes in our entire state. So if you go to any other part of North Carolina and you see a lake, it's human-made. Most of our water system is streams, creeks, rivers, wetlands, and marshes. But that being said, Helene did the most damage in the mountains. And that was a place that was a climate refuge. Like, you can track who bought property, who migrated to these places. They picked it because it was on high ground. They picked it because it didn't have a history. It was out of the FEMA floodplain maps. But that entire part of our state was completely devastated about a year ago. So what we used to sequester to the traditional areas, right, where everybody paid attention, the coastal areas close to the ocean, even in the Piedmont, that's where we're going to focus for the rest of the conversation. The mountains, in fact, also felt the effects of climate change. So to reference one of your previous department heads, Richard Weller, that is the imperative for landscape architecture. It's a planetary global exercise that's expressed locally. We really firmly believe that. But this chart shows the curve of what we consider natural disasters over the past years. And you can see by its curve how it's accelerating and it's getting more pronounced. Also, where these disasters occur, right? So this is analysis that was done as a part of an LAF Innovation Fellowship that was talking about really guidelines for rural resilience and how that should be treated. You know, once again, it highlights, you can see how much of that pink is not on the coast, right? One of the sad parts is that some of the fastest growing parts of our country are the parts of the country that are at the most risk, namely Texas and Florida. But even in North Carolina, you can see that cluster. Some of it is coastal, but some of it is really far inland. And I know the text is really small, but what I want to share is that rural areas represent 2.5 times more places than urban places here, right? So even though it's coded by county and smaller areas, 2.5 times as many rural areas are affected by disasters nationally than urban areas. As I mentioned, I am not a country person. I am not a rural person, right? And when I go to rural and country places, that is the first thing I say to them, because I believe in transparency. But my wake-up call was when we got hit by Hurricane Matthew, right? So this is in 2016. It was what is formally considered a 500-year storm, right? Where the percentage of a storm of that size hitting is really, really infinitesimal. And what I would say is in the last decade, we've been hit with 3 500-year and 1,000-year storm in a 10-year period. So for people who use those metrics, right, it's also a reminder that our vocabulary and our way of analyzing these things is out of date, needs an update. So the frequency and the intensity of these storms is increasing. We repositioned our whole department to be of service to the state in terms of disaster recovery. So we all agreed as a faculty that our imperative was to really be of service to the people who were most affected. We had a faculty member at UNC, Chapel Hill at that time, Gavin Smith, who ran a very substantial resilience program there through their planning department, major grants from the Department of Homeland Security and other things, who started the Hurricane Matthew Disaster Recovery and Resilience Initiative, which was a supplement to ongoing state activities. And through that process, we talked a lot about what can we do to help communities prepare. We have a lot of resources, even to this day, less resources than we used to have, but even at that time, for the immediate crisis, right? So as soon as a place floods, FEMA would show up with trucks and they would shut things down and they would start chains to provide emergency services. But what we found at the same time was they were asking really complicated questions, right? They were like, well, what do you think about the future of your community? How do you feel about moving out of the floodplain? Do you want someone to buy out your property for you? And you got to think about this, like in that crisis moment, when you don't know where your relatives are, you may have lost all of your physical possessions, you have no form of communicating with other folks. It's probably the last time you want to ask somebody about long-range planning. Right. But we do it because that's the policy initiative and that's the pattern that was put out there. So our approach was like, can we build a series of materials to help communities build their own awareness and understanding in between, right? And we don't even have to be there, right? But how can we start to use visualization, use data, use other bits of information to encourage communities to have these ongoing conversations so that when a disaster strikes, they've already talked about things. They've already become aware of the lingo. One of the simple ones is that most people have no idea what their options are when they're faced with a tragedy, right? Like a natural disaster. The way that they write all the rules are arcane. The different sources are hard to find. They usually rely on professionals to interpret them for them. So we wanted to visualize that and say, look, here's some options if you want to remain in place. You don't have to be afraid of contemporary architecture or architecture that is more resilient. It can work within neighborhood fabric and still work within the character of your communities. And we did it in multiple ways, online so that people could access from their phone, physical guides that they could keep at libraries, and on and on and on. So it was a good exercise. And so after Hurricane Matthew, that was actually our first step. It wasn't immediately to jump into these communities and help with recovery. It was to build a knowledge base that they could sustain a long-term conversation. But we were asked to then take a look at one community in particular. And that community is called Princeville, North Carolina. Princeville is unique because it is the first town founded in the United States by free African Americans. It's about 90 minutes away from Raleigh. Most people have never heard of it. Right? It was founded as Freedom Hill in 1865. If you follow Southern history and the legacy of the Civil War, when the American Army, I usually refer to it as the Union Army, but it was the American Army. When the American Army went through the South and blew up Confederate places, formerly enslaved African people used to follow the American Army and encamp next to them for protection, right? Either from other Confederates that were local or from other folks in the South. And so this started as one of those camps, so-called contraband camps. And it started as Freedom Hill. That was their aspiration. Renamed Princeville in 1885 after Turner Prince. There's a sidebar to this story, which was the federal government wanted them to name it Garfield Town in honor of President Garfield. But they picked Turner Prince, who was a local carpenter, over the president. So that tells you sort of the chutzpah of this community, even in the 19th century. It was primarily carpentry and agriculture based. So a small town across the river from Tarboro, which we'll talk about in a second. Tarboro predates the United States. It predates the Revolutionary War. And it was built on high ground. Freedom Hill, inaccurately named, was built in the low-lying floodplains of the Tar River. And you will find that pattern across the South. There's a term called racialized topography, which raise race and altitude across the American South. And you will find that a disproportionate number of Black communities in particular are built in what's known as the bottoms. Not because they wanted to be there, but because that was the only land available to them to buy at that particular time. So Princeville was one of those. The images that are in black and white are buildings that no longer exist in Princeville because of recurring flooding and destruction. The color images came from our work there right after Hurricane Matthew, where we met with officials and dealt with things. And so the first thing is, you might think if you're working anywhere in the world on resilience efforts that people know what a floodplain is. They don't. They don't know where they are in relation to a floodplain. They don't even know what that language means. What was an eye-opener to people in Princeville is that not only were they in the floodplain of the Tar River, but that floodplain intercepts the flooding of 5 separate rivers and subwatersheds. They all converge just north of Princeville, right? So they're dealing with water from 5 different municipalities, not just one. Right? About 80% of Princeville is in the floodplain. Right? You think about that one, right? And they do have records of flooding. They've had catastrophic flooding for centuries, right? The thing that's interesting about it is that they keep coming back to rebuild, right? So this is an image from Hurricane Matthew and shows you Princeville, the Tar River is on the top of the slide, before and after the storm, right? They were told all kinds of stuff. We could build levees for you. We could do all kinds of drainage systems. We could do all this stuff. None of that worked, as you can tell. So when we were asked to help, the first thing is, well, what are we supposed to do? The second one was, well, maybe this isn't a directed thing, meaning our job is to share information and share potential futures and scenarios, not to tell people what to do. We made a call to all of our friends. In the middle of that image is Jeff Kearney, who at that time led the Gulf Coast Resilience Center. He's now at Florida. On the left is Marshall Purnell. He was the first Black president of the AIA. The other guy way on the other side is Carlton Ely, who wrote the Equitable Development Guidelines for EPA. All these people came for free. We had 30 professionals that came from all over the country that had experience with disaster recovery. And we said, look, how are we going to model the right kind of conversation for a community dealing with this kind of trauma? We had the luxury, because of our technical expertise, to call upon resources that the community couldn't, right? So we could call FEMA, we could call Army Corps of Engineers, we could make calls to higher order people, and they came. And they explained for the first time to the community why Princeville floods and why it keeps on flooding. So in some ways, we enabled a conversation just by our presence where they could have direct interaction with decision makers. We also modeled how do you bring these things together. So this was a week-long workshop. What you can't see outside of that image was a bunch of armed people from the Department of Homeland Security. And if you've ever dealt with disaster recovery, you're going to find that there's a lot of military people involved with that. So as you might imagine, that's really off-putting to people, right? When they're dealing with these particular kind of issues, you walk in, you see people with guns and, people who you're not quite sure where their loyalties lie. But we kind of overcame that and embraced this collaborative spirit. That's a mix of some of our students, a lot of Princeville residents. The young lady with the circle around her face, Marquetta Dickens, we'll come back to her, but she's a former NC State Wolfpack basketball star who was from Princeville, who came to this workshop saying, oh, we don't need a plan. I've got a plan. This is what y'all need to do. And we were like, this is exactly what we're looking for. Because usually when you're in community, you run into the gatekeepers. You run into the elders, right? They're feeling you out to make sure you're safe and you can work with folks. It's rare in some cases when you deal with younger people and younger generations. So that was an eye-opener to us, is that, the environment that we created invited that kind of participation. What it led to is what you get out of a charrette, right? And we were bound by some of the rules of FEMA. The shortest version I can give you regarding Princeville is, rather than relocate, get bigger and acquire more land that's in a higher place. So you don't abandon the town, you make the town bigger, and then you remix the town. So rather than put people in a position where they feel like they have to walk away, they actually have a bigger town that's safer and more resilient. So we were talking to the state, who was optioning 54 acres on higher ground adjacent to the town, to say, hey, look, we would love to actually make Princeville bigger. And we would love if you would kick in and provide this land for the town. So we did simple sketches. This was a rethink of the Tar River edge and the historic core. That's a rethink of what's possible in that 54 acres. The state did actually kick in the 54 acres. They generated a new master plan for the whole town. They are in the process of building the infrastructure to establish that. And one of the selling points is we wanted to put emergency services on the higher ground. So the next time that a big flood comes, there's a place of retreat within the town. People don't have to leave the town. They can go to the town. So that's underway. Actually, after that too, we thought about what is the greatest resource that this town has? Well, it's their story, right? Since most people don't know it. And is there a way to build a reciprocal relationship with folks to bring resources, to bring attention? And so there in the Triangle region where we are, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, there are all kinds of school groups that do all kinds of summer programs. And we're like, look, just go 90 minutes that way and go to Princeville, you know? And we found money to pay a nonprofit based in Princeville to lead the tour. The image that you're seeing right now is that group, the Enviro kids, looking up the Tar River at what's known as Shiloh Landing. And they decided to start the tour there, which is really interesting. That is the last navigable point on that river coming south from Virginia, where enslaved African people disembarked from a boat about midway into that picture, and the smaller boats were rowed to shore and then walked to the center at Tarboro for sale. That's what local people decided to say, this is how we start our story in Princeville. And so there have been rounds and rounds and rounds of these tours. I may have told the story last time I was at Penn, but I don't think anybody, hopefully nobody was in class last time I was at Penn. Y'all look young and good students. But I'll briefly retell this story. When we took the Enviro kids there, this building was their visitor center, which had all their information about the history of the town, but because it was water damage, there was nothing there. So one of these kids standing on the steps says, well, I wish this museum was on wheels. And we were kind of like, well, what do you mean on wheels? And they're like, well, when the storm comes, you just hook it up to a truck and you drive it away, you know, and then when the storm goes away, you bring it back. So I go back and talk to the head of the School of Architecture, David Hill, and I was like, you're not gonna believe what this kid just told me. And he kind of goes, well, you know, we had the funding for design build this summer, but our client just fell through. Maybe we can do that. So we had a whole conversation with the town of Princeville about a mobile museum. We added layers to the conversation about you could use it for advocacy. You could take it to the state capitol. You could take it to HBCUs. You could take it to other towns and sort of tell the story of this town and spread the image. And so 8 weeks later, there's a mobile museum, right? One thing I liked about that was the scale of the issues that we're dealing with is so vast, and the commitment that we ask communities to make in partnership is so immense in time and resources and emotional energy that there aren't usually short-term positive material impacts in the community. We ask people to wait until we get this grant, wait until we change this policy, wait until we do these things. A way that we have found that has built more trust and more reciprocal relationships is to pepper these processes with short-term wins. Just keep adding them. And so this turned into a short-term win that you all enjoyed. Through other work, right? Through collaboration and through partnerships, the Conservation Fund in North Carolina and the Core Network and other places, hired local kids to build local trails, built rain gardens at the local school, advocated for the school not to be closed in Princeville, but updated and weatherized and reopened because it was an important community anchor. Design Build worked on mobile classroom work for students that were displaced during the storm, so ways that you could still learn science and technology and math even though the school was closed. So that's some of the design build work in the school. And that circle is also Marquetta, who founded the first nonprofit in Princeville called Freedom.org. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but in order to attract certain kinds of funding and certain kinds of partnerships or philanthropies, communities that have nonprofits are more advantaged than others. Princeville had no nonprofit. She started it and very successful. They decided to build the social network and the social resilience network by having homecomings, right? So people who were displaced elsewhere due to the flooding, inviting them back so they can reconnect and share stories and remember the place. And it turned into this Black Farm Tour that they started in 2002. They teamed up with Triangle Bike Works, who designed a century ride. There are apparently people who ride bikes more than I do. But people poured into the town and rolled through historic sites, and it's grown every year since 2022. And the farmers have flipped their farm sites adjacent to the town to accommodate people for everything from day spas to kayaking on the Tar River to kind of demystify and take the fear away from the approach to the water. And I'm not taking credit for any of this. We did that first step, but this enabled them to take further steps to build their levels of resilience. And it was really great, and it's still bubbling, right? Still bubbling up. All that being said, that process made us really frustrated and feel defeated because we were still working within the constraints of policies and structures that we knew were wrong and that we knew were outdated. So it was an interesting time when Jessica and her team contacted us to contribute to the chapter, because we were at that point of saying, what's going to be required to make a new way to do this? And how can we do it in a way that can scale up and become more systematic? One of the biggest structural patterns were the restrictions on funding associated with FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, which has been severely degraded in this administration. But if we rewind the clock a few years, one simple example, their approach to thinking about it was nobody should be living in the floodplain, right? So our job is to buy you out. Our job is to, anybody that has a property there, you apply for funding, we'll give you what we consider fair market value for your house, you sell it, you give it up, but in trade, it has to become permanent open space. And you can't make any economic income or economic development on that space. It's basically open space, right? Which in many towns that have been affected by this results in what's known as a checkerboard urban plan, right? Where it's a neighborhood that used to be designed for, say, 16, 20, 30 houses, now only has 5 houses and has poorly managed open space, continuing to fragment community fabric. Another constraint was this cycle of ramping up with tons of resources immediately after the crisis, and then between crises, all those resources go away. And it's the in-between crisis time that is the most important time for communities in resilience and recovery. They have to build their capacity. They have to build their technical know-how. They have to change their infrastructure. They have to track resources for reinvestment. That can't happen when you're immediately after a flood, right? So it was great timing. And so getting to the issues, that chart on the bottom is hard to read, but in the case of Princeville, one thing that is interesting is that the population went up after every disaster. People weren't moving away. And even after Hurricane Matthew, more people moved than were there before, right? Why would you move back to a place that was just devastated? One idea is this one called place attachment. Your sense of home, right? This is a hard conversation because I teach at a university. Very few of y'all are from Philadelphia. You came here for academic and economic opportunity. Many of you may never go back home again. So this isn't a judgment, but it's to say in the rural environment, particularly in North Carolina and in the South, place really matters. Your connection to the ground really matters. The fact that you had generations before you really matters. Your whole worldview is framed by that knowledge being passed generation by generation. And that's not portable, and it's not replaceable. So as crazy as it sounds, there are some communities that would willingly do that for the preservation of their social and cultural ties, rather than relocate. We also learned that there are real economics to relocation. And this is really one of the big models that we were punching at, because this century will see the most mass relocation due to climate we may have ever had in human history. More people are going to move because of climate change in this century than maybe any other time in the history of our folks. And it's a real consideration to think about what that means, right? This one talks about buying power. So I know there's lots of detailed information there, but I will distill it for you. If you were in Princeville and you wanted to sell your house and it was in a floodplain, And let's say you paid $175,000 on it over 30 years, right? But you come in and the federal government says, yeah, we'll give you $45,000 for it. It's in a floodplain. Where are you supposed to go to get an equivalent quality of life, right? So we know that anecdotally, but this is more of a empirical understanding. And the thing to look at is all of the places that are considered equivalent places that are outside of the flood risk are in black on the right on that top chart. And all the rural communities that we're working with are in the pink circles way at the bottom. So on average, most people's buying power is only about 50 to 60% of what is required for them to relocate for an equivalent lifestyle. So this is true for our region, but if you're working on this issue elsewhere in the country or globally, it's something to look at when you're thinking about mass relocation. What's going to be required in treating people justly and equitably to afford the lifestyle that they once had or an equivalent, that the barrier is very high, right? The other one that came out and is really talked about in the chapter at length is capacity and the challenges of capacity facing rural communities. One of the arguments in the book is that because of economies of scale, cities and metropolitan regions generally have more capacity as defined here. Government staffing, right? People who know policies and laws and can manipulate them and deal with them for decision making. Community education, right? More resources like this great institution, right? That can provide technical expertise for detailed issues. Engagement. So, not saying they do it all the time, but there's more capacity to engage local communities. Socioeconomic trends and expertise to attract, manage, and maintain whatever is decided. This list comes from Headwaters Economics. So this is an economic development group, and their framework was adapted in the chapter to apply to issues of resilience. That last one is really important, and we'll talk about why in a second. This is a graphic representation of capacity in our FEMA region. So we're in Region 4, that's area in pink on the US map in the lower right-hand corner. And you can see that blue line on the chart, that's the gap in capacity, right? Between more well-resourced urban areas and rural areas. It's a significant gap in all those categories. So how do we fill it? Well, this was one of the responses, and I will give credit where it's due. This is one of the premier programs that Andy and Travis developed out of the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab after lessons learned from Princeville. And Princeville was actually the first community to receive this process called flood printing, which is a way of using more contemporary data than what was then available through FEMA to talk about flood risk, to talk about capacity, and to talk about alternative futures for land other than the binary build open space that FEMA proposed. Through the flood print process, one of the innovations in data, which is not so innovative now, but was innovative then, was LIDAR. FEMA didn't use LIDAR when they did floodplain maps, right? If you look at a floodplain or a firm map, it's just some weird line. If you're on one side of the line, you're in the floodplain. You're on the other side of the line, you're out. And everybody who has been using those for any period of time know that that's garbage. And if you're in rural areas, unless there was a disaster, this is interesting. If there's a disaster, they have to do new maps. But if there's no disaster, those maps could be 30, 40 years out of date because they don't have the resources to update them. So you're relying on data that's completely wrong for life-changing decisions for communities. LIDAR is different because it can pick up levels of microelevations that those maps can't. Right? So your house might actually be in the middle of a block that flooded but didn't flood because it was high enough. You'd have no way of knowing from a FEMA map at that time, but you could tell it from LIDAR. So that's Princeville through LIDAR. In terms of different elevations, the lower, the darker color, the lighter, the brighter color. This helped with elevation analysis, so a lot by lot analysis of the elevation of the structures, which in urban areas is crazy. Like you can't do that. But in small rural areas, you can. You can figure out, that house is a foot taller than that one, or that house is 3 feet lower than that one, even on the same street, on the same block. That house has a porch that's elevated 3 feet high. That house is concrete on slab, So that's a house by house analysis. And essentially it's a 3-part sort, right? One is candidates for elevation. One is foundation work. One is actually out of the floodplain. And shockingly, not all of Princeville is in the floodplain. When you did that analysis and compared it to FEMA, and then the real world example of what happened with Hurricane Matthew, there were parts of Princeville that didn't flood. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because that kind of empirical information was what was required to attract funders, to attract alternative funding resources to FEMA. As long as we were just going to FEMA, we just had two choices. But if you go to foundations, and if you go to conservancies, and you go to other agencies, they're more flexible in terms of what those possibilities are. So this whole menu of land use options opened up, right? Maybe it's habitat, maybe it's stormwater, maybe it's food, maybe it's other forms of economic development. That's not possible in the FEMA framework. And it resulted in this composite, which is more of a mosaic of possibilities, once again. But that gave a level of certainty that allowed philanthropic organizations to jump in and say, yeah, we want to try that, right? We want to see if there's an alternative to this binary decision that we're forced in through federal government policies. So this is the Conservation Trust of North Carolina. They formed a Princeville Collaborative to help with that long-term legislative managerial gap that that town faced, to hold these different entities together, to fund and manage projects, to essentially pick up the burden that people in Princeville were unable to do. We've continued, right? So Hurricane Matthew was in 2016. That image is from 2 months ago in Princeville. And one of the things that I've learned from Andy in particular that I appreciate is stacking resources and grants. So if you have a project, you don't just go for one grant, right? You peel that project into its component parts and you go for 10 grants, but you only have one project, right? So one project is being written and developed for 10 different funding sources instead of one. I was like, Andy, you're really smart. Andy went to Michigan too, so yeah. So this is from, of all people, the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Why would the North Carolina Department of Transportation care about Princeville? Well, they're trying to pilot a study for mapping unmarked burial grounds, African-American, enslaved African-American, and indigenous populations. And I was just talking to you earlier about a relationship with the Hollow-Saponi. This is part of their ancestral grounds. And when we talked to both groups, well, Princeville was pretty easy because we've been working with them for 10 years. When we were talking to the Hollow-Saponi, they were like, well, what do you mean? When we talked about the need, and you may be thinking the same thing. Well, there are departments of transportation getting sued all over the country right now, namely in Texas and Florida, the two hotspots of development and flood zones, for accidentally running into the remains of people while they're building freeways and expanding roads. There are churches that have stopped entire processes. They're paying out all these resources. So North Carolina, to their credit, wanted to get ahead of that curve and say, well, we got to figure out a way to avoid that. And so when we talked to them about it, we talked about the reciprocal component of it. In return, in addition to impacting NCDOT policy, they will have now documentation of resources they didn't know they had, right? And essentially for free, because we have a multidisciplinary team with archaeologists and a number of other people, and it's literally documenting oral histories, talking to people in the neighborhood, working on participatory mapping. Where do you think things have occurred? We had a free scanning day, bring in, old photos or old property maps and share with us, and we will in return give that right back to you in digital format, because you're still under risk of a hurricane, and we don't want you to lose those elements. So in digital space, it's more portable. You can upload it to the cloud. You won't lose all this precious information. And on our end, it helps us to point the agency to important pieces. So that's the Princeville part. This is the Hollow-Saponi part. They championed in North Carolina the largest intertribal powwows. They restarted that about 20 years ago. So this actually is more than just the Hollow-Saponi tribe. That's about 5 different tribes across the state going around in the Great Circle where they greet people. But as a part of that, we had our own spot there to talk to people about burial grounds. And in this case, more sensitive because of looting, which is a real problem. There's a real issue with revealing that information between communities because of harm that was done in the past. So we've had to be very careful about navigating that. We're going to close. This is a diagram that came from a friend who used to be at Duke, and this came from the Green New Deal Super Studio, which we ran at LAF several years ago, with a very, very, very big thank you to Penn for helping with that particular process. So thank you for that. We were grappling with the scale of climate change and the urgency to act. But how does that work translating lessons learned on the ground into policy? And Deb was at Duke, and she helped us think through, I was surprised that in terms of public policy, that they use landscape vocabulary, right? I didn't know that. So in her mind, you have niches, which is the lowest level, which in your mind might be a project, right? Might be something that is finite, right? So small site that you're working on. But that's where innovation kind of happens, right? Where you can explore, you can test, you can push ideas. The ones that work go up to that middle one, which are regimes, right? In which case you start to build sort of a community of folks that celebrate sort of these best practices and elevate them and disseminate them. And then, your goal is to get it up to the top, to the landscape, where it just becomes a norm or a value, where you're not questioning it anymore. This is just the way we do things. We were thinking about that with regards to broader issues of climate change and adaptation. But I think this also applies to this question as we deal with resilience and with climate change, and as we start to rethink models, and which is the topic of the book, which I encourage you to really look at. And it forces us to ask really critical questions at each stage, because what we found is that people felt immobilized by the scale of the problem, but then frustrated because innovations that were happening at one level weren't permeating, weren't bubbling up to the top. But if we have that view, and if we have champions at each one of these layers, we can get to that. This is the last slide. So these are just a few considerations I want to leave with you. The first one is data, and how important rapid innovation in data is impacting how we think about the particular issue. As I mentioned before, when we started in Princeville, one of the frustrating parts was the level of detail and clarity in the data upon which decisions were being made. And that innovation of LiDAR opened up a whole new door on thinking about strategies and thinking about work. That innovation is not going to change, so paying attention to changes in data matter. The other one is going to sound a little bit counter to that, but it's time. We've been working in Princeville 10 years, right? That is not a typical practice model in landscape architecture. It's usually fee for service, right? And when you're done, you're done. But what we're learning with resilience is that we need ways to incentivize longer term relationships, both before the project starts and after it ends. So that's another opportunity for innovation, because the longer you spend time in a place, the more you build trust, the more you build a more detailed, comprehensive understanding of it, the more opportunity to catalyze innovation. Implementation, we talked about not waiting until the end of a project, particularly if it's a planning project, for people to see results. So thinking creatively about how in your process you can spin off things that make material change in the short term, maybe even before the project is done. That's something that we learned in that process. Filling capacity gaps, that's probably a whole nother lecture. Andy is probably the best person I can think of to talk about that in terms of how they position their lab. But you will be amazed at how many towns don't have a mayor, don't have a fire chief, don't know who's in charge of utilities, have no idea who FEMA or Army Corps of Engineers is. You could give them $10 million today and they would freak out because they wouldn't have the capacity to manage that grant, to report on it. So there are all these things that are around design that are barriers to communities really fully maximizing the value of design to make a change. So that's important. Long-term partnerships for sure, but practice models. And I will say, as someone who led a Ghana study abroad studio for a decade. I'm taking 300 people to Ghana, West Africa in my life. The idea of just popping in somewhere for a few weeks and thinking you can solve something, I think are over. There's a role for that, but for substantial, lasting change, we need a different model. I don't think a paratrooper model is the model anymore. I think it's more like a holistic healer. Someone who's patient, someone who's empathetic, someone who has multiple skills to bring to bear, someone who's willing to address the short-term needs as well as the long-term ones. So that's one of the models that I think is going to be one of the most contested ones in the century as well. Is like, what's the best way that landscape architects should practice in this century, given the challenges that we're facing? So luckily I'm old. My job is done. That's your job. Thank you.
So I think we have time for questions from the audience. We've got some mics if folks want to raise their hands.
Hi, thank you so much, Kofi. My name's Gabe. I'm in my last year here in the program, and honestly, it's kind of a low-hanging fruit question, but I'm really curious your response to just how you kind of shift people's mindset to, we're taught here in landscape architecture school that we're in the most urban world that we live in, and it's only getting more urban, but there are still these people in rural areas facing these problems, and how do you shift people's mindset, really?
Yeah, I think that's still the global perspective. I think if you look globally, particularly in places dealing with the effects of climate change, urbanization is associated with economic opportunity, the increased capacity, economies of scale. You don't have to distribute resources as much. There are whole countries that did forced relocations. Some countries that did them a couple generations ago. They're using that as evidence. So what I would say is, I don't think, at least my part of the talk is not to persuade you that rural and urban are equal. It's not. But it's to say that in that binary, we miss some nuance. And with attention to some of the finer details, particularly governance and long-term co-creation and support, that rural communities aren't as far off as we think they are. So it's not a blanket statement of saying, rural deserves to survive. That's not my place to say. But it has been a learning experience to me as an urban person to understand that as complex as those gaps are, they can be filled. And if they are, those places can achieve a level of resilience that we usually just associate with urban areas. So I think it's to prevent people from just dismissing out of hand that rural futures aren't possible. So I would never argue that it's better than urban, but I would say that now that I've learned more about it, there are things that we can actually do. It's not do something or do nothing.
Thank you, Kofi. I guess one of the things that is in the back of my mind that I'm kind of grappling with is how I think we often think of cities like New York City as this is a hotbed for innovation. This is where the models are going to come from. We're all going to look at some of these well-resourced big cities to understand what resiliency looks like, and whether that's coastal or otherwise. I think we sort of often see that as sort of the source of where big, new, innovative ideas are going to come from. And then there's the struggle of okay, how do we translate this elsewhere? And I think one of the things that's interesting about the projects you presented is the possibility that there are types of innovations that really should and have to come from smaller places.
Yeah.
So the example of, the understanding every house.
Yeah.
And just saying, we couldn't do this in a big city, but we could learn from it probably in lots of places.
Right.
So I'm not sure what the question is. It's just something in the back of my mind and thinking of, are you demonstrating that there are types of innovation or types of rethinking in your the graph of like projects up to landscapes where you see new ideas that are really like where the size, the smallness really matters.
I got you. I think I've got that question in there. Thank you for that. One section I didn't talk about a lot in the talk, but is in the chapter, is the multiple benefits created by nature-based solutions, which is to say, you do a project and you need a place to store the stormwater. You go to one profession and they just dig a big hole and say, well, there it is. Whereas landscape architects have a really interesting ability to talk about multiple benefits, right? So what someone just sees as a stormwater retention or detention facility becomes wildlife habitat, becomes water purification, becomes, has all these multiple lives. And, what I'm thinking about right now is from the summit to the dialogue that Kate Orff led at that summit, where she's talking about the backstory of living breakwaters, which I didn't know, right? So most people, you escape Kate Orff, like it's like a magic wand, like bling, 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 like all this stuff just kind of came out of air. But she kind of went way back and said, how they came up with that whole concept. And what I didn't know, which she shared then, was they had to rewrite all of the harbor line policies in New York City for free in order to make living breakwaters legal. That oyster texture thing that just got implemented a year and a half ago that they're building now was illegal based on current policies. And there was no capacity or infrastructure, even in the city of New York, to do that. So she was talking about, you want to do something that affects climate change immediately, but when you're faced with all those realities, as she said, it was 10 years from the time that they dreamed that thing up to the time where they got there. And most of that was what we call sweat equity, like uncompensated work that would have that impact. Now there's a model, right? So for people who are risk averse, you can take them out there and show it to them. Like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then there's the trickle down component. And I think that's always going to be a role of better resourced places. But when you think about nature-based solutions, that is the currency of low density places that are primarily unbuilt. Agriculture, I'm not going to romanticize it. It's a very ecologically and environmentally devastating practice, particularly industrial agriculture. But there are more opportunities in those environments to look at the possibility of nature-based solutions. So I won't pick a side, but that story helped me understand that even in that extremely well-resourced environment, it's still, you still got to work. So if it's a matter of like less work, more work, when she said 10 years, we've been working on principles for 10 years too. I mean, you could say the benefits will be magnified because there's more people in New York City, but the ability to innovate, I don't think should be restricted to one type of development pattern.
Hi, Kofi. Thank you for your presentation. It was really great.
Thank you.
There's multiple parts in your presentation when you touch on the importance of trust and how trust is built over time.
Mm-hmm.
And with you spending 10 years in Princeville, could you talk a little bit more about the experiences where you had breakthrough with the community and you saw yourself actually building that trust with the community in Princeville? And how long did that take?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they really trust me or not. I just thought about that. They just keep saying thank you because it's all free. Watch out for that in the community work, by the way. Well, I think, a couple things. One is we have some friends that we rely on that aren't at state. Every once in a while we bounce thoughts off of them. Ifeoma Ebo, who's at City College in New York, She has a really famous quote talking about moving at the speed of trust. So the willingness to adjust the speed of what you're doing based on the level of trust you've established. And if you're not familiar with her work, that's someone to look at. She did a lot of important work regarding particularly safety in public housing in New York City. That changed a lot of the paradigms about how they approach that. So she's one. And Deb Gunther at Methuen is another one that informal advisor in a lot of the work. Formal advisor for some of Andy's work, but informally. And Methuen's a multidisciplinary firm based in Seattle. She works a lot with tribal groups and indigenous and native groups, and has thought about how to model reciprocity. It's the best way I can say it. So, for example, like here's one thing I learned from that was helpful in Princeville, was to be honest about what you need. Not what's written on the paper or what the requirements of the project is, but just to come up front to the table of like, look, I need this. So I'll give you an example. In Princeville, we're working on stuff and we want to do this tour, and we're thinking about this nonprofit leading this walking tour, and they're kind of like, it's fine as long as you hire local people. So the fact that they were just very forthright with it and said, well, we care about what you're doing, but we also care about the economic well-being, particularly young people in our community. That level of transparency helped to understand the priorities and sort of the gates that you go through to deal with it. With the House-Pony Tribe, and this was true also we worked on a project for the UNC American Indian Center where they wanted the first, and I'm gonna be honest with you, my mama told me to say indigenous people. So when they started talking about we want to be called American Indians, I was like, what? So, you're not Indian, and this actually isn't American. So I had to kind of turn that part of my brain off. But the idea of them having the right to define themselves and talk about how they wanted to be called. But in that center, what built the trust was allowing them the space to lead and start with their stories and their perspective, not to come in with our technical know-how and our expertise, but to shut up, right? And so the kickoff for that garden planning workshop, and now they have a garden, which is great. It's like right across the street from the American Indian Center. All kinds of tribes come and use it. They feel like it's a home place on campus. But it started with, we asked a really kind of abstract question. We were like, can you think about the first real wonderful memory you had in nature? They didn't require any technical expertise, didn't have to draw nothing, didn't have to know no rules. It was literally asking people like that emotional kind of content. And once everybody around the room, and that's something that reminded me of church in a way. It's like you go to a church meeting sometimes, like, man, we've been here 3 hours. More people talking? No, don't get up and say anything. No, I gotta go. They were like that. So I kind of had a cultural tie to them because everybody got up and told really long stories about what was. And it was interesting because not having been asked that before, it was the first time they heard each other say it. So I was just fly on the wall, kind of taking that note in. But that ability to give space to allow people to self-define and in a way play catch up, right? And say, well, based on what we heard, based on what you said, based on what you did, here's some ways we could go, That kind of pattern, that kind of recirculated helped to build that. So those are two things that come to mind. There are many more, but thank you for that question.
Hi, Kofi. Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. My name's Hannah. I'm in last year of the program here as well. I wanted to ask you, I guess, to talk a little bit more about one of the things you said towards the end about, moving the field of landscape architecture, maybe the field of design overall, away from like a sort of project-based model towards maybe a relationships-based model. These are my own words I'm putting on how I understood what you were saying. And I think that there are, organizations and firms that are moving towards that type of that have that point of view, that have that attitude towards their work. But I also see a lot of firms that don't. And I guess my question for you maybe is, if you had advice for us as people about to graduate from this program, future practitioners, I guess how to navigate an industry, I guess maybe if we're focusing more on the private side of things, how to engage, maintain these ideas and maintain these perspectives in an industry that's moves really quickly and prioritizes, rapid turnover and as you said, I guess you said paratrooping in. I'm not exactly sure if that was a question, but if you had advice or thoughts you could further add to that, I'd super appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, if you're in debt, just take the first job you get. So don't be a snob about your first job. It's just your first job. When I graduated from Michigan, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I went to a firm that was multidisciplinary and learned as much as I could. I bounced around a lot. And then figured out a niche that I was interested in, but it took a couple of years. So I know this is the frustrating part, is that everything is urgent, right? But your skill set is really valuable. I think that's probably one thing that I will hold on to regardless, no matter where you are. Not everybody thinks that landscape architects do. We take it for granted because we're in a room together. And all of you, well, I guess y'all don't think alike, but there's enough in common where you can at least have a conversation. I've been at tables where if I didn't say anything, nobody would mention the environment at all, or people at all, or that kind of thing. So I would say don't feel like just because where you are, you're not building your skill set, building your experience level. I think it's the old school way of landscape architecture was like an apprenticeship, where you knew when you graduated you didn't have everything you needed, but you had to essentially intern and apprentice with a professional in order to get that skill set together. So my vote is not to think about how you are right now as like your finished form. It's not. And on the flip side, staying connected to the institution and to organizations that are about ideas, because that's one thing that helped me when I was, early, was, we would enter design competitions and we'd go back to Michigan all the time and sit in at lectures, and we had like this whole kind of group of people, sharing experiences and working on it. So you can sustain that part of you despite of where you are and where you're getting your paycheck. But if it turns out that you don't land in the place that exemplifies your values, I wouldn't consider that a failure or a problem. I think there's more of a life process thing in terms of when you're ready to really then, assert what you're doing. And I think that it's just a matter of staying connected so that as you're starting to think about these ideas, like what are different forms of practice, and how are ways that we could do things, that it becomes the kind of curiosity that is productive and constructive and not destructive, right? It doesn't tear you down. It makes you more open to different opportunities. So you'll be okay. You'll be okay.
I think we'll all be okay. And thank you tonight for this. It's really, really lovely. And thanks all to the audience, and thanks to Kofi. So.